Captain John Hart sat in the cold, dimly lit command room of the Galactic warship Vanguard, staring at the holographic map that displayed the target area. His fingers twitched slightly, hovering over the controls of the massive starship. The mission was about to begin. It was routine. At least, that's what they had told him. But deep down, Hart knew this mission was different. Something about it didn't sit right. He had been a soldier for years, a highly decorated officer in the Galactic Council's military force. Hart had been through dozens of battles, fought in numerous campaigns, and seen horrors that most people could never imagine. He had trained to fight and kill, to follow orders without question, and he had done it all without hesitation. But as he looked at the hologram in front of him, he felt something stir within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The target, a peaceful alien colony on a remote planet. The mission, to wipe them out. The reason, unknown. The Council had simply given the order. For the greater good, they had said. But Hart didn't believe that anymore. The cold, calculating voice of his commanding officer echoed in his mind. "Captain, you have your orders. The Galactic Council demands it." Hart clenched his fists. He had spent his entire career following orders, just like every other soldier. He had killed countless beings in the name of the Council, believing it was necessary for the greater good. But now he was starting to question everything. He stared at the glowing hologram of the alien colony, the peaceful planet teeming with life. Hart knew what would happen if they went through with the mission. The colony would be decimated. Millions of innocent lives, gone in an instant. He could already imagine the screams, the panic, the burning cities. He had seen it all before. But this time, it was different. This time, he couldn't ignore the growing knot in his stomach. The weight of the decision was suffocating. He had always followed orders because that's what soldiers did. But now, the lines between right and wrong were blurring, and for the first time, Hart felt a surge of anger deep within him. Why was he fighting? What was he even fighting for? Hart's hand trembled as he reached for the control panel, setting the ship's coordinates for the attack. His mind raced, but his body was frozen. The countdown to launch had begun. In 5 minutes, the attack would commence. There would be no turning back. "This is what I do," he thought. "I'm a soldier. I fight for the Council. It's not my place to question orders." But then, something inside him snapped. The thought of another innocent life being taken in the name of the Council, another peaceful planet destroyed for reasons he couldn't even comprehend, was too much. His pulse quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. Without thinking, Hart slammed his fist down onto the console, cutting the countdown short. The room fell silent. The flashing red lights on the control panel blinked urgently, indicating that the mission was in jeopardy. The silence was deafening. What have I done? Before he could even process what had just happened, he heard the familiar voice of his superior officer crackle over the intercom. "Captain Hart, what is the meaning of this?" The voice was cold, distant, filled with the authority of someone who had no interest in hearing excuses. Hart took a deep breath, his pulse racing. He knew the consequences of his actions. He knew this was it. His career, his life, everything he had worked for, was about to come crashing down. He had made his choice. "I'm not doing this," Hart said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "I'm not killing innocent people anymore. I'm done." There was a long pause. The voice on the other end of the comms crackled again, this time tinged with disbelief. "You're quitting, just like that?" "Yes," Hart replied firmly, his decision now final. "I'm quitting. I'm done with the military. I'm done with the Council. I'm going to Earth." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't care what they thought. Without another word, he turned away from the control panel and began to make his way to the escape pods. His heart was racing, but there was a sense of relief in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt free. The weight of the mission was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of clarity. The war, the battles, the endless killing, They were not his responsibility anymore. The council could go to hell. As he made his way down the long corridors of the warship, Hart could hear the footsteps of his fellow soldiers behind him, rushing to stop him. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew what he had to do. The escape pods were located at the far end of the ship. Hart's mind raced as he ran, the sound of his boots echoing through the metallic hallways. He could hear the voices of his comrades calling after him, warning him that his actions would have consequences, but he didn't care. He couldn't stay. He had to leave. As he reached the escape pod bay, Hart noticed that the doors were already sealed shut, but he didn't hesitate. He punched in the override code, the emergency system flashing a warning before the doors slid open with a hiss. He was almost there. But just as he reached the pod, a voice called out behind him, "Captain, you're making a mistake." Hart turned to see Lieutenant Kessler, one of his closest friends in the military, running toward him. Kessler's face was a mix of confusion and concern, but Hart could see the sadness in his eyes. "John, you don't have to do this. You've fought with us for years. The council will forgive you. You can't just run away." Hart paused, his gaze meeting Kessler's. He wanted to tell this friend everything. The doubts, the questions, the frustration that had built up over the years. But he didn't have the words. Instead, he simply shook his head. "I can't do this anymore, Kessler. I can't keep following orders without questioning them. These people, these innocents, they don't deserve to die." Kessler opened his mouth as if to argue, but Hart didn't give him the chance. He turned, stepped into the escape pod, and slammed the door shut. A deep hum vibrated through the pod as the emergency systems activated. The pod launched, tearing away from the Vanguard, the massive warship quickly shrinking behind him. Hart felt the rush of adrenaline as the pod shot through space, away from everything he had known. His heart was still pounding, but it was a different kind of pounding now. It was the feeling of freedom, the feeling of escape. He had made a decision, and he was going to stick with it. The pod's engines hummed steadily as it sped through the cold expanse of space. Hart glanced at the control panel. He had set the course for Earth, a planet he had only heard of in stories, a place far removed from the brutality of war. He didn't know what awaited him there, but he knew it was better than what he had left behind. Earth, a place of peace, a place of humanity. For the first time in years, Hart allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to live in a world that wasn't ruled by the endless cycle of war. A world where people didn't have to fight to survive, where there was more to life than just following orders. He leaned back in the pod's seat and closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he was excited to see where it would lead. The war was over for him, and as the pod accelerated toward Earth, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope stirring deep inside him. The escape pod shot through the cold, endless void of space, its engines roaring in the distance as it sped away from the massive warship Vanguard. Captain John Hart's chest was tight, his breath shallow, but there was something else too, an odd feeling of freedom. It was hard to describe. For years, he had been a soldier, following orders without ever really questioning them. Now, as he sat alone in the pod, speeding away from everything he had known, he realized just how heavy that life had been. The war, the endless battles, the endless killing, and the constant reminder that he was just a pawn in someone else's game. He glanced at the small, flickering control panel. Earth. That was where he was headed now. A place he had only heard of in whispers, stories passed from one soldier to another. Earth. A blue and green planet in the far corner of the galaxy. They said it was a place of peace. They said humanity was different from the other races, more compassionate, more human. But could it be true? Could a planet that had been isolated for so long really offer the kind of sanctuary he was hoping for? The pod's shaking pulled him from his thoughts. A warning light flickered on the control panel. A quick glance confirmed it. The pod was unstable. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a surprise. The escape pods weren't exactly designed for long journeys, and after what had just happened back on the Vanguard, Hart had no illusions that the military would be happy with his escape. The ship's security would be on high alert. They would know that he was gone by now. He gritted his teeth, knowing that the Council would never let him leave without a fight. If they caught him, it would be the end. They would never let him walk away from the life he had known. He was a deserter now, a traitor, and traitors never survived in the Council's military. But as the pod began to rattle violently, Hart couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. Whatever happened, he had made his choice. He had done the right thing. And no matter the cost, he wasn't going back. The pod's thrusters whined, struggling to maintain stability as it tore through space. Hart clenched his fists. The vibrations in the pod grew worse. It felt like the ship could fall apart at any moment. His mind raced. The journey to Earth was going to take several days. With a damaged pod, he couldn't afford to waste any time. "Come on," Hart muttered under his breath. "Stay together, just a little longer." He adjusted the controls, trying to stabilize the pod as best as he could. The shaking didn't stop, but it became more manageable. The ship steadied, and the warning lights dimmed. His pulse began to slow, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to relax. The worst of it was over. For now. The silence that followed was almost peaceful. The pod glided silently through space, its sleek design cutting through the void. Hart turned his gaze to the small window in front of him. Outside, the stars stretched endlessly across the dark expanse, tiny pinpricks of light that seemed so distant, so unreachable. The vastness of space was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, he had been on the Vanguard, a member of the most powerful military in the galaxy. Now he was here, alone in this tiny pod, heading toward a planet he knew nothing about. It was a gamble, but he didn't have any other choice. The Council would never let him go, and staying in the military would mean more of the same, more orders to destroy, more lives to take. He shook his head. "No," he thought. "I'm done with that life. I'm done with the bloodshed. I'll find a new path. I'll make a new life for myself. I have to." As the hours passed, Hart drifted in and out of sleep, but it was hard to get any real rest. The small pod was cramped, and the constant hum of the engines made it difficult to focus. But despite the discomfort, he couldn't ignore the growing excitement inside him. He was leaving everything behind. He was starting over. He had never truly questioned the reasons for the wars he fought in. For years, he had just followed orders, believing in the ideals of the Galactic Council. But now, as the vastness of space stretched out before him, he realized how small and insignificant that life had been. The military was nothing more than a machine, grinding up the lives of countless beings for the Council's agenda. There had been no room for compassion, for understanding. And now he was free. As Hart floated through space, his thoughts turned to Earth. What would it be like? Was it truly a peaceful place, like the stories said? Or was it just another world, full of conflict and strife, just like the ones he had left behind? He didn't have any answers, but that didn't matter. He would find out soon enough. Whatever Earth was, it had to be better than the life he had known. The war, the killing, the endless conflict, it was all behind him now. After a while, the pod's computer beeped, indicating an incoming transmission. Hart's heart skipped a beat. He reached for the controls and activated the communication system. "Captain Hart," a familiar voice crackled through the speakers. It was Lieutenant Kessler, the voice of reason, always trying to bring him back to the fold. "You can't escape. You've made a mistake. The Council won't let this go. You know what they'll do." Hart's hands tightened around the controls. He had been expecting this. He had known that Kessler would try to talk him out of it, but he wasn't interested in hearing it. He had made up his mind. There was no going back. "I've made the right choice, Kessler," Hart said firmly, his voice cutting through the static. "I can't keep fighting for the Council. I can't keep doing their dirty work. I'm done. Kessler's voice trembled on the other end. You're throwing away everything, John. All your hard work, your career, your friends. You're just going to run away. Hart's eyes narrowed. He could hear the desperation in Kessler's voice, but it didn't sway him. I'm not running, Kessler. I'm walking away, and I'm not going back. There was a long silence. Hart could almost hear the wheels turning in Kessler's mind. But in the end, Kessler didn't respond. The transmission cut off with a soft peep, and the pod was once again silent. Hart sighed, his mind still spinning with everything that had happened. He had just left everything behind. The military, his career, his friends, the life he had known. But none of that seemed important anymore. What mattered was the future. What mattered was the chance to start over, to make a new life. He turned his gaze back to the stars outside the pod. The trip to Earth would take a few days, but at least he had time to think, to reflect, and to wonder what kind of future awaited him on that distant blue and green planet. Would Earth accept him, or would it be just like everything else he had known, a place full of war and violence, where the strong ruled and the weak were crushed underfoot? He didn't know, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel afraid. He didn't feel alone. And that was enough for now. Captain John Hart felt the sudden jolt as the escape pod systems made their final adjustments. His heart raced. The tension he had been carrying for days, ever since he made the decision to leave, finally started to break apart as the pod entered the atmosphere of Earth. He looked out the small window, his eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. This was it, the end of everything he had known, and the beginning of something entirely new. He had finally made it to Earth. The pod shook again, this time more violently. The air was thick with turbulence, and Hart could feel his stomach drop as the pod descended further into Earth's atmosphere. He had never flown on a planet like this before. The ship he had used for years in the military had been a state-of-the-art warship designed for the fastest speeds and most dangerous missions. But this pod was something entirely different. There were no advanced shields to protect him, no massive engines to pull him through the atmosphere. It was just a small, fragile thing, and it felt like it was about to fall apart any second. His hands tightened around the controls. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he concentrated on keeping the pod steady. The shaking was intense now, and the noise from the air friction outside made it feel like the whole pod was being torn apart. But through it all, one thought echoed in his mind. I'm almost there, just a little longer. A sudden beeping noise interrupted his thoughts. The console flashed a warning, and a red light blinked on the panel. The escape pod was losing altitude faster than expected. No, Hart muttered to himself, quickly adjusting the throttle. He tried to steady the pod as best he could, but he was barely able to keep control. The air pressure outside was like nothing he had ever experienced. It was as if the planet itself was pushing back against him. The pod's descent slowed for a moment, then began to pick up speed again. Hart clenched his teeth, focusing on the controls with everything he had left. He had no choice but to ride it out. He wasn't going to let this new life, this new hope, slip away from him so easily. With a final, powerful jolt, the pod finally hit the ground. There was a loud crash as it slammed into the soft earth. Hart's body jerked forward in the seatbelt holding him back just in time to prevent serious injury. His heart raced, and he blinked rapidly, trying to shake the disorientation from the crash. The world outside the window was blurry, a mix of green, blue, and brown. It took him a moment to regain his senses. The pod was quiet now. The shaking stopped. He took a deep breath and unclipped his seatbelt. His hands were still shaking as he slowly pushed the pod's door open. The cool air of Earth flooded in, and the moment he stepped outside, he was hit by the scent of fresh grass, the earthy smell of trees, and the soft breeze brushing across his skin. It was unlike anything he had ever felt before. It was peaceful, calm, serene. He stood still for a moment, taking it all in. The tall trees around him stood like silent giants, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. A distant mountain range was visible on the horizon, and the sky above was the clearest blue he had ever seen. The Earth he had imagined was nothing like the harsh, war-torn worlds he had left behind. This place, this was home. He didn't know how or why, but in that instant, he knew that this was where he belonged. The escape pod sat behind him, half buried in the soft earth. It had survived the harsh descent, but it was clear it wouldn't be going anywhere soon. Hart didn't mind. It wasn't the pod that mattered now. It was the land beneath his feet, the people he hoped to meet, and the life he hoped to build. His military training kicked in as he assessed his surroundings. The area was quiet. No signs of immediate danger. He could hear birds in the distance and the sound of a gentle stream nearby. He noticed the beauty of it all, the colors of the trees, the way the sunlight dappled the ground through the leaves. But there was something else too, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The air felt different, charged with a quiet energy that he hadn't felt in a long time. He had always been a soldier, trained to fight, to think strategically, to stay alert. But now, all of that seemed irrelevant. For the first time in years, he didn't need to worry about what the next battle would bring. There was no war here, no mission to complete, no orders to follow, just the freedom to breathe, to think, to be. He took another step forward, his boots crunching softly against the earth. The feeling was foreign, yet exhilarating. He couldn't help but feel like he was walking on sacred ground. As he moved away from the pod, he spotted something in the distance. Movement. His instincts kicked in, and he immediately crouched down, taking cover behind a tree. His hand instinctively went to the small blaster he carried at his side, a weapon he'd carried for years. He didn't know who or what it was, but his mind was still wired to be cautious. He had no idea what Earth's inhabitants were like. Were they friendly? Or were they like the other races he had fought against, quick to turn hostile at the sight of an outsider? Through the branches, he could make out the shape of a figure, someone or something moving through the trees. It was humanoid, walking on two legs, but it was too far for him to make out any details. His pulse quickened. What if it was an enemy? What if the council had sent someone to track him down? His hand tightened around the blaster, ready to react if necessary. But then, the figure came closer, and he could see more clearly. It was a human. A woman. She was wearing simple clothes, nothing like the military uniforms Hart had been used to. She had long, dark hair, and her face was a mixture of surprise and curiosity as she noticed him standing there. Hart froze. Was this a trap? A human soldier from another world? The woman took a step toward him, then stopped. She held her hands up in a gesture of peace. Hart didn't move. His instincts told him to be careful. She was alone, and he couldn't be sure of her intentions. "I didn't expect to find anyone out here," the woman said, her voice calm and gentle. "Are you lost?" Her words were simple, but they struck Hart like a lightning bolt. Lost? I'm not lost, he thought. But the question lingered in his mind. He wasn't lost in a physical sense, but in a deeper way, he had been lost for so long. He had been lost in the war, lost in the life he had been forced to lead. This was the first time in a long time that he had felt like he might finally be found. "I'm not lost," he replied, his voice a little rough from the emotions he hadn't expected to surface. "I'm just trying to find my way." The woman smiled, the tension between them easing. "Well, you found Earth," she said. "I think that's a good start." Hart's heart thudded in his chest. The way she said it, so casually, made everything feel so real. He was standing on Earth, the place he had dreamed of, the place he had fought to reach. "Earth," he repeated quietly. It sounded so much more alive now that he was here. He glanced at the pod again. It had brought him to this moment, but it wasn't the destination. The real journey was just beginning. The woman stepped closer, still cautious but no longer on edge. "You've come a long way," she said, studying him carefully. Where are you from? Hart hesitated, not sure how to explain himself. Should he tell her the truth? Should he tell her about the war, the council, the escape? It felt like a lifetime ago. I'm from a far place, he said finally, his voice softer now. A place where there's a lot of fighting. I just wanted to get away, to find something different. The woman nodded. I understand, she said simply. It's not always easy, is it? To leave everything behind. Hart met her gaze. He wasn't sure what would happen next. But for the first time, he didn't need to worry. He had finally found his way to Earth, and for the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe again. Whatever happened now, whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that Earth was his new home. The woman smiled again. Well, you're here now, and you're not alone. With that, she stepped aside, motioning for him to follow her deeper into the forest. Hart stood there for a moment, taking in the peaceful world around him. This was it, the beginning of his new life. No more fighting, no more war, only the unknown future and the possibility of a fresh start. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Captain John Hart walked alongside the woman through the dense forest, the soft crunch of his boots against the earth sounding almost too loud in the quiet surroundings. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves above them, and the scent of pine and fresh grass filled the air. His mind was still racing, trying to process the overwhelming feelings of finally being on Earth, this peaceful, strange, and beautiful place. He had made it. But what now? The woman led him deeper into the forest, moving with ease through the trees, as though she knew these woods like the back of her hand. Hart followed closely behind, trying to match her pace, though his military training had not prepared him for this. He wasn't used to being so far from a battlefield, so far from danger. He was used to constant alertness, always ready to react to a threat. But here, on Earth, it felt different. After a few moments, the trees started to thin, and Hart saw the outline of a small cabin in the distance. It was nestled in a clearing, surrounded by wildflowers and tall grass. The structure was simple, nothing like the fortified, high-tech buildings he was used to back on his home world. But it was cozy, warm, and inviting. A stark contrast to the cold, sterile environments he had been surrounded by for years. The woman glanced over her shoulder at him, noticing his gaze. That's where I live, she said with a soft smile. It's not much, but it's home. Hart didn't know what to say. He had spent so many years fighting in wars that he had forgotten what it was like to have a place to call home. The idea of a simple life, without the constant threat of violence or war, seemed almost foreign to him. But it was also a thought he couldn't ignore. Could this really be his new reality? Could he actually build a life here? They reached the cabin, and the woman pushed open the wooden door, stepping aside to let Hart enter first. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled of fresh wood and herbs. A small fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting a soft glow across the room. There were shelves filled with books, plants, and a few personal items scattered about. A painting on the wall, a handmade rug on the floor. It was all simple, but it felt alive, real. Please, make yourself at home, the woman said, motioning toward a small table in the corner. I'm sure you've had a long journey. Hart nodded, his eyes still scanning the room. He felt a strange sense of peace, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was all too good to be true. Could he really escape everything he had known? Could he truly leave the war behind? The woman moved toward a small stove in the corner and began preparing something. I'm Celia, by the way, she said, her voice calm and welcoming. I didn't catch your name. John, Hart replied simply. John Hart. She turned around and smiled at him. Well, John Hart, I hope you're hungry. I got some stew on the stove. It's not much, but it'll do for now. Hart's stomach growled at the mention of food. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until now. The last few days had been a blur of desperation, fear, and escape, and he hadn't had time to think about much else. But now, in this peaceful place, his body was reminding him of the simple needs it had ignored for so long. "Stew sounds great," he said, sitting down at the table and watching as Celia prepared the meal. It was hard to believe that this woman had welcomed him into her home so easily. He was a stranger, an outsider, yet she had treated him with nothing but kindness. The contrast between this and the cold, calculated interactions he was used to back in the military was startling. As Celia served the stew, she sat down across from him, her eyes curious but not intrusive. "So, John," she began, stirring her spoon in the bowl, "what brings you to Earth? You said you're from a far place. What kind of place is that?" Hart hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. He had been trained to keep his emotions and past hidden, to keep his personal life locked away. But something about Celia's genuine curiosity made him want to open up, to share the truth. Maybe it was because he had nowhere else to go, no other place to turn. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't in a constant state of danger. "It's complicated," Hart began, his voice low. "I was part of a military unit, stationed on a planet far from here. It wasn't like Earth. It was a place of constant war. We fought against all kinds of enemies. Alien species, hostile forces, you name it. We were always on the front lines. And I was good at it. Too good, maybe." Celia listened carefully, her eyes never leaving him. She didn't interrupt, giving him the space to speak. "But I couldn't take it anymore," Hart continued. "The constant fighting, the loss. It started to change me. I started to lose myself. I didn't want to be that person anymore. So, I made a choice. I left." He stopped for a moment, unsure if he should continue. Celia didn't say anything, just patiently waited for him to speak. Her presence was calm, and it was comforting in a way Hart hadn't expected. "I didn't have a plan," he finally said, his voice rough. "I just knew I couldn't stay there any longer. So I found an escape pod and left. I didn't know where I'd end up. I didn't know what would happen next. But I ended up here, on Earth." Celia nodded slowly, as though she understood exactly what he was saying. "I'm glad you made it," she said quietly. "Sometimes we need to leave things behind in order to move forward." Hart didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't used to talking about his feelings or his past, but in this moment it felt right. It felt like Celia wasn't judging him. She wasn't expecting anything from him. She just wanted to listen. "I don't know what I'm going to do now," Hart admitted. "I don't know how to live without the war. It's been my whole life." Celia smiled gently. "It's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. You're here now, and that's what matters. You have time. You can take things one step at a time." Hart looked at her, and for the first time since he had left the battlefield, he felt a sense of hope. Maybe it wouldn't be easy to start over. Maybe the war had left scars that would never completely fade. But he didn't have to do it alone. There was no rush, no pressure to figure everything out right away. He could take his time. They spent the rest of the evening talking over dinner, the fire crackling in the background. Celia asked him more questions about his past, and he slowly opened up, sharing bits and pieces of his life. He told her about his military service, the battles he had fought, and the reasons he had left. She listened attentively, offering kind words and understanding. It felt nice, something he hadn't felt in a long time. As the evening wore on, the stars began to appear outside the cabin windows, twinkling in the night sky. Hart stood up and walked outside, needing a moment to himself. The night air was cool against his skin, and the quiet of the forest felt like a balm to his soul. For the first time in years, he wasn't worried about an attack, a mission, or an enemy. He was simply here. He was safe. Looking up at the stars, Hart realized that this could be his fresh start. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer a soldier at war. He was a man who had found his way to Earth, a place of peace, of hope, and of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance to truly live. The days on Earth had felt like a dream to Captain John Hart. After years of endless combat, life in the peaceful forest cabin with Celia was a relief. The morning sun filtered through the trees, birds sang, and the air was fresh with the scent of pine. For the first time in what felt like forever, John didn't wake up to alarms, gunfire, or the harsh commands of military superiors. Instead, he woke up to a warm breakfast and the sound of Celia's laughter. But deep down, he knew this tranquility couldn't last. He had escaped from the war, but the war hadn't forgotten about him. One evening, as he was walking back from the nearby creek, he felt a strange chill in the air. The sky had been clear all day, but now, clouds gathered ominously in the distance. It was as if the weather itself sensed the change. His instincts, those honed from years of service, flared to life. Something was coming. "Celia," he called out, urgency in his voice. "Something's wrong." She stepped outside the cabin, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. "What is it?" "I don't know," he said, scanning the horizon. "But I have a bad feeling." Before Celia could respond, a deep, rumbling noise echoed from the sky. It was a sound unlike anything John had ever heard before, and it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A shadow passed over them, blocking the sun for a brief moment. John's heart skipped a beat as he looked up. It wasn't just a cloud. It was a ship, a massive ship, a warship, and it was headed straight toward Earth. The ship's dark silhouette loomed ominously in the sky, its shape unmistakably familiar. The design was unlike anything Earth had ever seen, sleek, sharp, with an intimidating presence. The markings on the ship were those of the Galactic Council, a powerful, ruthless organization that controlled the vast majority of the galaxy. They were the ones who had been waging wars against countless planets, Earth being one of their many targets. John's mind raced. He had known it wouldn't be long before they came after him. His escape from the war had left a mark on the Galactic Council's radar. They wouldn't let a soldier like him just slip away without consequences. "They found me," he muttered under his breath, fear and anger flooding his chest. The Galactic Council wasn't the kind of enemy that let go of anyone so easily. Celia's face paled as she looked up at the ship. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are they here to attack?" "Yes," John replied, his voice cold and determined. "They're here to make sure I don't get away." The warship hovered over them, its size so immense that it seemed to block out the entire sky. It was like a massive shadow hanging over Earth, a reminder of the destruction it could bring. The ship's weapon systems came online, and a low hum filled the air. John knew they weren't here to make peace. They had come to take him back. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the ship, a voice amplified through a communicator that reached John's ears. "Captain John Hart." The voice called, cold and emotionless. "You are hereby ordered to surrender yourself to the Galactic Council. Your actions have been deemed a threat to the stability of the galaxy. Return to us, and we will grant you a quick and painless end. Resist, and we will show you the true meaning of regret." John's blood boiled as the words echoed in the air. They thought they could threaten him into submission. After everything he had been through, he wasn't about to go back to the life of a soldier, of a pawn in their endless war. Not now, not ever. He turned to Celia, his eyes fierce with determination. "I have to fight," he said. "They won't stop until they get what they want." Celia grabbed his arm, her grip strong despite her fear. "You can't fight them alone, John. They're too powerful." "I know," he said, his voice softening for a moment. He could see the concern in her eyes, the way she cared for him despite knowing so little of his past. "But I don't have a choice. I won't let them take me back." Celia hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Then we fight together." John felt a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't alone in this fight. Earth may have been his escape, but he had found something here worth protecting. The thought of Celia by his side made him feel stronger, more determined than ever. He began to assess their options, his military instincts kicking in. We need to get inside. I don't know how long we have until they start their attack. Together, they ran inside the cabin, and John immediately began searching for anything that could be used to defend themselves. He wasn't sure what kind of weapons Earth had, but he was going to find a way to make them work. The Galactic Council had ships, technology, and weapons far beyond anything Earth had ever seen, but Earth had something they didn't: the element of surprise. As he searched, Celia grabbed a small radio from a shelf. "I can try to reach out to some of the local resistance groups," she said. "Maybe they have weapons or resources that can help us." John nodded, though he knew it would take time for any help to arrive. In the meantime, they had to prepare for the worst. He grabbed a few metal pipes and improvised makeshift weapons, quickly going over tactics in his mind. If they could stall the Galactic Council long enough, Earth's forces might be able to mount a defense. The warship overhead seemed to sense their movements, and a series of sharp, pulsing lights beamed down, scanning the ground below. John instinctively ducked, pulling Celia to the floor as the lights swept over them. "They're scanning for us," he said, his voice tense. "They won't stop until they find me." Celia pressed her hand against his arm, trying to calm him down. "We'll be fine," she said, though her voice trembled with fear. "We'll make it through this." Just then, the first wave of attacks came. Explosions rocked the ground outside the cabin as the Galactic Council's warship fired its powerful energy blasts at the forest. The trees were ripped apart by the force of the blasts, sending debris flying in all directions. The sound of the explosions was deafening, and John could feel the tremors beneath his feet. Celia screamed as the force of the explosion threw her off balance, but John was quick to react. He pulled her behind a sturdy rock, using it as cover. "Stay down," he shouted over the chaos. "Stay low and don't move unless I say so." The ground was shaking beneath their feet as the Galactic Council's warship continued its assault, firing more energy beams at the forest. John's mind raced as he tried to figure out their next move. He knew he couldn't keep hiding forever. The Council's ships had weapons far beyond anything Earth could handle, but they didn't know the terrain. They didn't know the land like John did. He clenched his fists, determination burning in his chest. He wasn't going to let them destroy Earth, not after everything he had seen here. This was his home now, and no one was going to take it away. "We're not going down without a fight," he said, looking at Celia with a fire in his eyes. Just then, the sky lit up as more ships appeared, descending from the clouds. The Galactic Council was bringing everything they had. But John wasn't alone anymore. Earth wasn't the helpless planet they had once thought it was. As the war began in full force, John knew this was only the beginning. The Galactic Council had made a grave mistake in thinking they could control them. And now, they were about to find out just how far a soldier would go to protect the ones he loved. The roar of explosions echoed through the air as John Hart and Celia crouched behind a large boulder. The forest around them was burning, trees uprooted and shattered by the relentless fire of the Galactic Council's warships. The once peaceful Earth that John had come to cherish was now a battlefield, and it was all because of him. His past, his escape from the endless war, had led them to this moment. But he couldn't regret it. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. "John, we can't just hide forever." Celia's voice trembled, but there was a fire in her eyes that gave him hope. She was ready to fight, just like him. "I know," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "But we need to be smart. We're outgunned and outmanned, but we got something they don't: our will to fight." The sky above them was filled with the terrifying sight of the Galactic Council's ships, their dark silhouettes against the burning sky. They were not just here to capture John. They had come to make Earth pay for harboring him. They had come to wipe out humanity once and for all. A massive energy beam shot from one of the warships, hitting the ground just a few hundred yards away. The shockwave of the blast sent John and Celia flying, and the force of the explosion left their ears ringing. John quickly got to his feet, grabbing Celia's arm to help her up. She was shaken, but her resolve was as strong as ever. "We can't keep running," she said, her voice determined. "There has to be a way to stop them." John nodded, his mind racing. He had spent years training for situations like this, but nothing could have prepared him for the full force of the Galactic Council. The ships they had unleashed on Earth were unlike anything he had seen before, massive, heavily armed, and capable of destroying entire cities with a single blast. But John had learned a long time ago that the key to victory was not always in the firepower. Sometimes it was in knowing your enemy, understanding their weaknesses, and using your surroundings to your advantage. "Follow me," he said, grabbing her hand. "I got a plan." They moved swiftly through the forest, keeping low to avoid the enemy scanners. The warships above continued to unleash devastating blasts, destroying everything in their path. The ground shook with each explosion, and the trees seemed to tremble in fear. John could hear the distant cries of the people who had already fallen to the might of the Galactic Council's weapons, but he wouldn't let their deaths be in vain. Not while he still had a chance to stop this. As they ran, John thought back to the years he had spent fighting in the Galactic Council's wars. The endless battles, the death, the destruction. He had been a soldier, a pawn in their game, but he had learned the one thing that mattered most: how to survive. Now he had to use that knowledge to save Earth. The sky suddenly grew darker as more ships appeared, their massive forms blotting out the sun. They had come in full force now, and John knew it was only a matter of time before the ground troops began their assault. The Council didn't leave anything to chance. They had a full invasion force ready to sweep across the planet, and if John didn't act quickly, humanity would be doomed. "We need to get to the military base," John said, his voice sharp. "It's our best chance." Celia looked at him, confused. "The military base? That's miles away, and the ships are everywhere. How do you plan to get there?" John smiled grimly. "We don't need to go there the usual way." The two of them had been running for what felt like hours when they finally reached their destination, a small, hidden underground facility deep in the forest. It was one of Earth's last secret weapon caches, a place that had been abandoned years ago. It had been designed to be a last resort, a place where humanity's greatest weapons could be stored in the event of an alien invasion. Now, it was their only hope. As they approached the entrance, John's eyes scanned the horizon. The warships had begun to land, their massive forms towering above the trees. The Galactic Council was not just here to capture him. They had come to conquer Earth. He knew they would stop at nothing to achieve that goal. Inside the underground facility, John quickly began to assess their options. The walls were lined with advanced weaponry, some of it so powerful that it could potentially level an entire city. But they didn't have the time to fully prepare. The invasion was already happening. The first wave of Galactic Council ground troops had begun their march across the planet's surface, and they were heading straight for the location where John and Celia were hiding. "Can you handle the weapons?" John asked, turning to Celia. Celia nodded without hesitation. "I can handle anything you throw at me." John smiled, proud of her. "Good. We're going to need everything we've got." They quickly suited up, arming themselves with high-tech rifles and explosives. The weapons were designed to take down advanced alien technology, but they were far from perfect. The Galactic Council's forces were immense, and John knew they couldn't win with just firepower alone. They needed a strategy, something unexpected that would turn the tide in their favor. John's eyes scanned the weapons rack until he found what he was looking for, a large portable EMP device. It wasn't perfect, but it would be their best shot at disabling the enemy's ships and their advanced technology. "We're going to hit them where it hurts," John said, securing the EMP device to his back. "If we can disable their ships, we might have a chance." Celia looked at him, her eyes filled with determination. "Let's do it." They emerged from the underground facility, weapons in hand, ready to take on the Galactic Council. The sky above was filled with the sound of ships and the hum of energy beams, but John wasn't afraid anymore. He had found his purpose on Earth, and now he would fight for it. As they moved through the forest, John's mind raced. They had to find a way to get close to the Council's ships without being detected. The enemy scanners were too advanced for any normal approach, so they needed to get creative. The forest provided some cover, but it wouldn't last long. The ships were sweeping the area with their scanners, and it was only a matter of time before they picked up John and Celia's movements. Suddenly, a thought hit him. They could use the very technology the Council had brought to Earth against them. The EMP device might be able to disable the scanners, creating a temporary blind spot in the enemy's defenses. "We need to get to the highest point in the forest," John said, pointing to a ridge ahead. "If we can get there, we can fire the EMP at the Council's ship and disable their scanners." Celia nodded, following him without question. They sprinted through the trees, their hearts pounding in their chests. Every step felt like it could be their last, but they couldn't stop now. They had come too far. They reached the ridge just as the warships began their descent. John could see the massive ships through the trees, their weapons aimed at the ground below. The Galactic Council's forces were closing in, and they were about to strike Earth with everything they had. "Now or never," John muttered, taking a deep breath. He positioned the EMP device, aimed it at the nearest warship, and fired. The device hummed as it released a burst of electromagnetic energy, sending a wave of disruption through the air. For a moment, everything seemed to go still. The enemy ships hovered in place, their systems glitching and failing. Then the ships began to fall from the sky, one by one. The EMP had worked. The Galactic Council's fleet was temporarily disabled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, humanity had the upper hand. "We did it," Celia whispered, her voice filled with awe. But John knew this was just the beginning. The Galactic Council would regroup. They would come back stronger. But for now, they had won a small victory, a victory that gave Earth a fighting chance. As the warships crashed to the ground, John and Celia stood together, ready to face whatever came next. The battle for Earth had only just begun, but they were no longer running. They were fighting back.